So welcome to the node.js Technical Steering Committee meeting for October 25th, 2023. We will follow our standard approach of going through the agenda, which was created in the TSC repo as issue number 1457. Before we get started, does anybody have any announcements they'd like to share?
Node 20 is now entered long-term support, so that happened yesterday. So we now have two long-term support lines, Node 18 still and Node 20.
Great, and thanks for doing the work to make that come out. It's great. Any other announcements people have to share? If not, I'm going to go over to the CPC and board meeting updates. We don't have Matteo or Rich this week, so I don't know that there's any updates on that front. This week was a working session, so I don't think there's any updates that I can think of either. So we'll move on to the issues that were tagged to the agenda. The first one is the Navigator object breaks projects in V21. If the person who added that to the agenda is here, just feel free to jump in. Otherwise, I'm just checking where we're at on that one.
I think that's pretty much resolved, no?
Matteo added it. Yeah, I think it's been resolved. The break was that there's two mistakes that we made. One was that we added navigator.hardware concurrency as the first property after navigator when navigator.useragent is by far the most popular one. So we should have either added them both together or started with useragent. They're both released now, so lesson learned. And we just didn't have anything in Canary in the Gold Mine to catch this. I started the process of adding support for next.js, which depends on PMPM. So there's an open PR to Canary in the Gold Mine to add PMPM. And then we can add next, and then we'll have next and all of its dependencies as another signal. So I don't know if maybe there was something in Canary in the Gold Mine, and this was before we declared bankruptcy and reset it. And so maybe there was a signal that we just missed, but hopefully this can help catch these types of things in the future.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess the lesson is we should always have a flag when we add the new globals going forward. So if this ever comes back, users can at least have a workaround.
I don't think I agree with that, because one of the other PRs that we landed was I put a little note under navigator, here's how to disable it, which is just -- import data URL that deletes the global. So we don't really need a flag for every global, since you can always just do that.
On the other hand, adding globals with flags allows us potentially to add them with the default being off, but the flag to add the global, and then having that in the server major with the default flipped around, so you could still use the flag to disable it. But that would then allow, if desired, that those things could be backported to sort of long-term support lines, but not added as a default global, but sort of an opt-in if it was behind a flag.
Sure.
Just putting that out there.
I think we already have too many flags, so if it's possible to do it without adding yet another flag, I feel like that would be preferable.
I think
maybe if we want to add a global in the middle of a line without waiting for someone.
I think the interesting thing about this particular issue, though, is that there isn't really it's kind of there's lots of code out there that's using heuristics to detect browser environments. And while we've added, I think it's user agent we've added now, and now I've seen some issues that are now talking about, well, there's code out there that's now assuming there's a process, navigator platform. So it almost does feel that this is almost like how far do we go with this navigator object? And while it, on the one hand, you might look at it and say, well, it provides the ability to have cross-browser node code out there, but then on the other hand, it is breaking stuff out there that's trying to detect and make different choices depending on whether they are in browser environments or in Node. So I don't think there's an official way of doing that sort of detection. So it does feel that every change we make in this area is a potential disruption to bits of the ecosystem.
I mean, there are lots of ways that people can try to detect if they're in a browser environment. You know, like actually, like this is actually user agent in particular is probably the best way, because it's like, well, the user agent string for Node says node.js in it, so it tells you right off the bat this you're in Node. It's like we were the only runtime that didn't have this. Like Dino and Bun had it, all the browsers have it. So now there is a cross-platform way to detect which environment you're in. So if you want to be more generic, be like, am I in any browser or any server side? That gets more complicated, but yeah.
Okay, so I removed that from that issue from the agenda. Anything more we should discuss live now versus in GitHub on this issue? Sorry, just confirming with Robin that we'll let them know when we're ready to go for the private session. Okay, so let's move on to the next issue, which is test swatch as flaky. I think that one I added to the agenda, just in that there was some discussion about how quickly we should be setting, like excluding tests that are marked as flaky. So an issue was opened and then immediately a PR was open to like actually mark the test as flaky. There was a few collaborators who were like, well, wait a sec, this seems awfully quick. So, you know, I think maybe, you know, we don't need to necessarily come to an agreement, but maybe if we just, I thought it'd be good if we figured out like a best place to discuss what the process or threshold might be for that. You know, should we just open an issue to discuss that in and agree to some? I think we, like personally, I think it'd be good if we had some agreement written down that says like, hey, in terms of a flaky test, you know, we could write down if it flakes once, you can immediately exclude it. Or we could come up with some other threshold that we think makes sense. But I think having that there so that we have some agreement would be good. So, and I see Joey has her hand up, so go ahead.
I think we can have some sort of like minimal, or like this is where like we cannot stand it anymore and we really need to mark it as flaky, and we you know, set a very, very, I don't know, high bar, so that for example, if it's been flaky for, I don't know, half a year, that's like absolutely like no, you cannot go like. But if it's only flaky for like, I know, 1 week, that might be too early. But like if we set the threshold to be very high at the beginning, we can, you know, maybe have fewer, like less resistance, and then we can, like, as we go, we can maybe adjust it. But I think having like a very high bar at first would be good enough.
Don't you like CI reliability thing bot or something that could just mark it flaky automatically, so there's no human politics involved in it?
So I was going to say, I think it was Marco has opened a PR on Node Core Utils to try and do some automation to automatically open PRs to mark tests as flaky. I have a few reservations because I think marking things as flaky is only half the story. And there's a real danger that we just throw things into a flaky bucket and never actually go and fix them. And the other thing, insofar as the CI is concerned, while marking a test flaky might make the build sort of yellow and be landable, it does mean then if you have anything that fails and you resume the build, all the yellow thing, you know, all the jobs that are yellow will get rerun. And that's not something under our control. That's just the way Jenkins works. So the more things you have that are yellow or not green, if you ever have to resume the builds, the more things will actually have to be rerun in the resumed. So I don't think automatically marking for things flaky is is the solution. It's a way of, I guess, sort of trying to sort of have some temporary stopgap to give some breathing space to land other PRs. But I think there is a point where, if we start just adding a huge bunch of things as flaky but not going back to fix them, then it's, we might as well just remove the tests, which I think sort of Raphael asked in chat.
Sorry, Raphael, did you want to expand on that, or?
No, just trying to elaborate on the chat that as Joy suggests, okay, if a test is flaky for like 6 months, I honestly prefer to just remove the test and open an issue about that, because marking it as a flaky, I doubt that will give us the stability we want to have, to just have a test. I think, I mean, we should also consider the kind of test, if that's testing on specific behavior that is definitely flag. For instance, we are testing Linux perf on a specific version, and we need to have that test. Okay, but I doubt that that's the case for the majority of the flaky tests.
Okay, Robert has his hand up.
Yeah, I mean, I think we also need to consider a little bit how people work. I mean, some don't like us to, flag test as flaky because then they will never be fixed. But I think that's a weird assumption that somebody would fix them if they're there. I think 80 or 90% of collaborators will just rerun the failed test. So that's what I do. I open the SI and run it again. I barely bother looking at what was failing, and I think 80% of collaborators do that. So we just end up with spamming the CI and making people annoyed. It doesn't actually solve so much. So I would second Raphael's suggestion that this kind of flaky test should just be commented away, and then we create a label or something with a GitHub issue that this test was flaky and was removed. If somebody is interested in working on that, please fix it.
Jeffrey had his hand up next.
Hey, I was just thinking, I feel like a more rigorous solution would be to somehow prevent flaky tests from getting into main in the first place. And that feels like something we could automate, like when a PR adds new tests, could our CI automatically run those new tests specifically in the that pipeline we have for checking a test for flakiness? We already have a way to run a test 1,000 times or whatever it is that checks if it's flaky. So if we did that automatically for every new test that every new PR added, then in theory we wouldn't get any new flaky tests added, and the problem would be solved. It would be like, well, you just can't land your PR until you write a better test. Then the author is really motivated to fix their test. It's not something where we have to cajole people to go back and fix it later.
That's an interesting idea, yeah, I guess.
That doesn't solve the current situation, though.
Yeah. So from my perspective,
yeah, but still, I feel like the current situation is we're continuing to dig holes as we're filling older holes. You know what I mean? So at least it solves it going forward, right?
I think you're both right, but I guess had his hand up, so let's let him.
So from my side, if let's assume something, there's a new collaborator, new contributor, they want to introduce something, they want to fix something, they want to add a new feature to Node.js, and whenever they open a PR, they see that there's unrelated changes, but they don't know that it's unrelated. So we can't make the assumption that they should know if it's a flaky test or not. So with knowing this, we should act accordingly, and we should make sure that the new contributors does not have a hard time contributing to Node.js. And with right now, even if it's setting flaky or not, from time to time, we have this really huge issues with CI machines, such as the disk is full. And because of that, all of the FS tests start to fail. This is one scenario. There's another scenario. If there are lots of FS tests that run at the same time and the IO is blocked, then FS watch tests always time out because we use 100 or 200 milliseconds for waiting. So these are all a part of like someone needs to fix this, and we can't rely on any of the existing Node.js teams to fix or look into the issue while like in the 48-hour scenario. Because if it's the issue with the test, then we need to wait for like that team needs to open a PR, then that team needs to wait 48 hours in order to land that issue. And then the original issue needs to be updated in order to land it. And it's extremely frustrating if you are a new contributor. And from my experience, even if it's a Windows or S390X or whatever
Or
the
if you're an old
architecture,
computer.
the operating system is, it's extremely frustrated. And even for me personally, I questioned myself about why am I running this 10 times? And it's getting worse and worse from time to time. And from time to time, it gets better. But the issue persists in all scenarios. And even if it's removing it or fixing it or just deleting it or just setting it flaky, I think we need to do something about it so that it makes our lives easier.
Yeah, I'll add that like part of what you described, we could change in a process. Like I think at one point we said, hey, let's say that you need to rerun and get to green. You know, we could change that to say instead of rerunning, you need to confirm that there's an open issue that says that that thing is flaky, right? Like, and if there's an open issue that says this is flaky, maybe we don't need to rerun, right? We just say like, you could go and say like, I saw these 3 flakes. Oh, here are the 3 issues for those 3 flakes. I can land this PR.
For the case of collaborators that doesn't look into the CI builds, they're not going to look for it again, and they're going to do it. And this requires checking for every issues and checking for issues in order to make sure that it's open or not. And it adds another step to frustration. It solves something, but it adds another thing that we need to check.
Right, but I'm just like, until we get a more stable CI, we could reduce the level of frustration. Like I'm just suggesting there might be ways where like by changing the process, we can make it less frustrating. It's not going to remove everything, but like rerunning, resuming the job 10 times actually could be much more frustrating than saying I've searched, oh, I can find these 3 issues that were flaky. I posted an issue. I can land it, right? Like that would take me less time and less context switches, because every time you restart the CI, you got to switch a context and wait for a couple hours. So we was just saying we could maybe make some adjustment that way. Richard has hand up.
Yeah, I'm pretty much against relaxing the process in that way, because my observation is that together with that observation earlier, the collaborators are just blindly resuming things without really looking. I have noted, I'm not going to name names, I have noticed that some collaborators have landed tests that are obviously flaky if you look back at the CI results of their own PR, but because they've been rerunning, resuming that they've just landed them. So I'm not convinced that if you allow individual collaborators to make judgment calls as to, oh, these flakes are known issues, so I can still land this. I don't believe that, given the number of collaborators we have, it's a huge number, that the only fair way is to have some process orientated where it is, the current process says the build must not be failing. I mean, it doesn't have to be green passing, you can have things marked as flakes, but there isn't human judgment involved, and that I think is fairer. for all collaborators. Otherwise, you're getting into a sort of I'd rather have something that could be measured by automation rather than relying on individuals to make correct judgment calls.
Joy, you had her hand up.
Yeah, I agree that people can land things that actually introduce flakes, not just tests, but also you can land bugs that, for example, if we rely on garbage collection to reproduce, it can be flaky. And I think we need to have some sort of automation to check past reliability reports to ensure that the flake has appeared before, and to just ensure that this is not the pull request that introduced this flake. I think that's important, and that's also why marking tests as flaky too early can be problematic, because that would interfere with the tracking of flakes, so that you do not have a clear idea when the flakes started to show. Having some records of failures would help to identify actual where the flake is actually coming from. Sometimes it's a bug, not really a testing.
I had my hand up, so I'm just going to answer to I understand Richard's point about not wanting making it easier, but if people are arguing that we automatically mark things as flaky, I think that's even worse than I think what, in line with what Joy just said. I'd rather have somebody basically say, well, yeah, I found an issue that says it's flaky. I'll tag my thing as here's another instance of that, and then move on, versus having to, versus us saying, well, instead of forcing people resume, we're just going to disable them all, right? And I see Richard S. hand up again, so I'll go back to him.
Yeah, so this is just awareness. I don't really know much about it. I did see somebody has raised an issue. I can't remember if it was an admin or TSC about some third-party flake tracking tool. I don't really know much about it. I do have some concerns about trying to add some third-party service into the whole sort of build test flows. And Matteo did raise an issue about security releases. We don't want to leak things to third parties for that, but it did mention something about tracking history. So the point about looking back and seeing how often those things have occurred. Someone has proposed some third-party thing that supposedly does that, but it would require someone to have some time to evaluate it.
Okay, so I think we should probably move on to some of the other issues and reserve the time for the private section. But it doesn't sound to me like we have a consensus on an easy way to go. So I'll take the action to open an issue in the repo to say, let's discuss what the sort of our criteria for actually landing something as flaky should be. I think we all agree once it gets to a certain point, it should be marked as flaky, but we need to, discuss how and what that looks like. So I'll open the issue, and then if everybody can sort of chime in terms of their proposals, I think that would be a good way to continue this conversation. Anything else anybody wants to add on that before we move on? Okay, the next one is revert, doc, promote, fetch web streams from experimental to stable. I don't know again who added that to the agenda, but if you're here and want to jump in, feel free. I think it was Matteo who added it, so go ahead. Right.
I didn't add. I think, like you said, it was Matteo. If I remember correctly, I think the summary is that the issue with that one was that it doesn't fit nicely into our current stability indexes. So the concern was that the fetch spec changes much more frequently than the node major versions, and the worry was that if it was a breaking change, strictly according to Semver, and Indici followed and went to a Semver version, we may not be able to then update that in sort of older versions of Node, and then you'd have a sort of issue with trying to keep things up to date. Initially, it was sort of suggested that in order to fit in our current stability models, that the fetch stuff should be fetch wedge streams should be still experimental. Yeah, but I think in Node 21 it has been marked stable. But I think there's still some follow up as to how do we communicate that it's going to follow the upstream fetch spec, which may mean that it changes, and whether that is a new stability index or some additions to the stability index that says something like this follows an upstream spec. So if the spec changes, even if that change is incompatible with previous versions, that we will still update that, even though we've marked the thing as stable. I think there's some concern about confusion to people reading the API docs as to the behavior of fetch in Node, and whether it would always be backwards compatible within like a Node version, or if it is going to follow the spec and therefore potentially have breaking changes. That was my understanding of the issue, and we did discuss it previously in the context of Node 21, and it was kind of decided that we will mark it stable in Node 21 and then try and have a discussion about what to do before Node 22, because Node 22 is going to have a much longer life than Node 21. So I think that's where we're at, which is it has been marked stable, but we generally, or collaborators generally do not feel that that is a current great situation to be in, because stable seems to be implying more a stricter sort of definition about how that API might change versus the probable expectation of people using the fetch API, which would that it would be interoperable and follow what the browsers do. But obviously browsers have a much shorter release turnaround than Node.
I'm sure we're going to get complaints either way. Oh, so Robert, I see you put your hand up.
I mean, the way I see it, we could, we don't update, or, Undici, which is implementation we're using, could, do a Semver major release when fetch has breaking changes, and we don't ship those we only ship those in Node Semver major releases. And if somebody needs, the browser compatibility and the latest and greatest, then they could just use the Undici package directly. I don't see any reason why Node needs to have the latest and greatest in terms of fetch.
And I would think that fits our model much better, because otherwise, experimental, I can see why we say, well, okay, it's, we've said it's experimental. But for anything else to basically be able to not respect Semver seems like a pretty big change, right? So what Robert just outlined seems like a model which fits our standard processes a lot better. Anybody else have any thoughts on that, or? I mean, Robert, has your proposal been made somewhere?
No, I just came up with it while I'm reading the issue.
Okay, because that's the one that would I would be like, yeah, that sounds good. I bet you there'll be some people who will be like, well, no, we should, but that one seems like the easy way for us to go as a project. It's like any other dependency. We don't pull in a Semver major, and we avoid things that are actually going to break people, right? So
the second question becomes, if we want to, but this is more of an Undici question, if we want to, separate out the fetch part into its own package with its own somewhere majoring, so that we can still, it reduces the maintenance load on Undici. But I think that's a question for a separate forum.
Yeah, I think this issue is linking through to an actual issue in the Undici repository where there's a wider discussion within Undici about fetch and stability. But it's kind of related, but it's also, I guess, separate because they have their own release cycles. So yeah, I don't know. Might need to get someone more involved with Undici to comment.
The bigger question though is the web streams. But as far as I know, they don't have so much breaking changes in that specification. And even if they have, we're not really updating so much the web streams in Node. So I don't think it's a problem in practice.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say. Like web streams doesn't change so often to be so worried about.
I think someone did say that we have changed something in a release where it was technically a break and change, but because it followed the web platform tests, we made it. I can't remember what area that was, but I think someone commented we did have some precedent there.
I'm sure I would, in that, like for that example, I would argue like we can always make an exception where it makes sense, but making it the default is not what I would like. That wouldn't be my choice, right? Like if somebody said, look at this, it breaks more people by not fixing it, then like, hey, yeah, we should be open to this. But like just hey, we're going to introduce, breaking changes because the spec change. Just before I go to you, I did want to ask, like, are the specs versioned? Like, I think it's fair for us to say that, like, Node implements version X of the spec, right? And if the spec changes to version .2, well, okay, that comes in the next version of Node, right?
Well, there is GitHub commit hashes, at least, that I know.
Okay, so I mean, specs really should be versioned if they're going to start making breaking changes, at least in my opinion, right? But so Yegis has his hand up.
So URL spec also makes breaking changes from time to time. A couple of months ago, it made a breaking change and they changed origin getter. But because nobody uses origin, it didn't break anything, but it got backported to 18 as far as I know. So other specs also makes breaking changes and they don't care about semantic versioning. So yeah, just an FYI.
This fetch seems to do something they call review draft publications. But yeah.
Okay, so I don't know, Robert, like, is the next step for you to make your proposal somewhere and see?
Yeah, it's usually me or Matteo doing the releases for Undici, so it will probably end up on my table anyway. So,
okay, so I'll take the next step for, Robert will make this proposal and we'll see how that goes. Because I think if if the Undici team and other people agree there, then that seems like a natural, that just fits the regular model of what we do with dependencies, right? So, yeah. Okay, I'm going to move on to try and get the rest of the things down in 5 minutes. So I'm going to move on to the next one. The tools: add package lock when installing npm directory. That one I added to the agenda. This, there's work in the security team. There was work to automate the update of dependencies, and the next step was to audit and improve how we build the repeatability of how we build our dependencies. That's important in terms of, I think in terms of our risk, if we ever had to go back to an old version and do a security release or something like that, we will actually want to be able to rebuild our dependencies in a consistent way. And the proposal here was that like actually adding the package lock gives us one step in that direction. We probably have other things as well. But there was some questions and discussion about like whether that made sense. So I just put it on the agenda here so that I could explain why I at least personally think it's important, and see if there were any questions about that. See, Richard has his hand up.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have a better idea, but looking at that current PR, and there is a link to a commit which shows an example of the package lock. It looks really weird because it's a fake package lock. It's like faking there's a top level, pseudo package, and then all of the installed dependencies are under that, and it just looks really, really bizarre. So I don't have a better solution other than maybe exploring. I think there's some stuff to look at SBOMs, which maybe this fed into or something like that. But the package,
I think that I would comment.
It seems to be a very odd solution for the problem.
In what sense? We want to repeat npm install. Isn't that what package lock is intended to do?
Right, but it's not the way that we actually install. It's faking up the install because we're copying things into depth. It looks really, really weird if you actually look at it. It's not. Package locks are normally so that you could do like an npm CI to replicate what's in the package lock, and I don't believe you can do that with what that PR is currently.
So I would agree. Like if the package lock looks weird, I think commenting on that, because maybe there's some way or specific thing. Like I'm more like, I think having, and I think the package lock that would let you repeat an npm install, which we did do somewhere. Maybe that PR doesn't quite capture it correctly. So that would be a good discussion, but capturing the metadata that we can use to recreate it is sort of the goal here, as opposed to, if that particular PR is right or not. So if you could add your specific concerns about like what looks wrong about that package lock, that would be great. Are there other questions or concerns on that one? Okay, I'm going to move on because we just have a few more minutes. The nvar node v8 coverage intermittently caused this process to hang. I think Matteo had added that one in. I don't know if there's any update or anybody who's involved in the discussion that wants to chime in on that one. I do see in the issue, Colin mentioned that he can't reproduce it anymore because Undici did a workaround of some sort.
Yep. Yeah, if I remember correctly, we have discussed it last week that and one of the suggestions I gave was like let's test if that the behavior happens on Node.js 21. So by looking to the thread, it does happen, but she did some workaround. So if Colin just revert, he will be able to get the process hanging, but apparently no solution yet.
Okay. Okay, so the next one then is support for file system-based persistent code cache and userland module loaders. 47427. I don't know who added that, but if you want to jump in.
It's me. Sorry.
Go ahead.
The idea was that, so there is this popular npm package that basically when you load a CommonJS module, it creates a code cache. It monkey patches the CommonJS loader to create the code cache and persist it to disk. And when you load it the next time, it will load that from disk and speed up the compilation process of the CommonJS modules. And this package has been very popular. It has like 15 million downloads per week, for example. And there's another library form of it that's also pretty popular. the motivation of this was also from some discussions on Twitter about speeding up the loading of modules. So a feature like this would speed up the compilation, at least on the second time the application is loaded, and like to use the cache instead of compiling the modules from scratch. So the reason why this is on the TSC agenda was that there was some concerns from Ben about securities. In particular, when it's persisted to disk, it's possible for an attacker to corrupt the cache. And the discussions that we need to have is about whether this is a big enough concern to block a feature like this. So I'd also like to give some points about supporting this feature despite the security concerns. Is that even though there can be more security vectors, attack vectors out there, the package has already been in the ecosystem, it has already been popular, and it has a lot of problems due to monkey patching. And by implementing something like this in core, we can at least deal with this kind of security stuff ourselves, and also fill the gap of whatever internals that this package cannot access in its patched version of the loader, and also open doors for supporting something like this for the ESM loader, which is something that cannot be done by this userline package. So yeah, that's basically what it is.
Okay, thanks. I think we're going to have to cut it at this point because we need to reserve the time for the private section and the update. So I'll leave that on the agenda so that we can talk about it again next time and continue the discussion in the issue, if that's okay with everybody.
Yep.
Okay. So at this point, we'll switch over to the private section, if everybody can stick around. Let me just